In the beginning, you may not recognize it for what it is. It arrives softly, dressed in familiar voices, wrapped in words that sound almost kind. But listen closer, and you will hear it, the hesitation hiding behind their sentences, the slight dimming of your light each time you share a dream too bright for their comfort. Jealous people rarely declare themselves. They do not need to. They speak in suggestions that shrink your vision, in reminders that sound like caution but feel like resistance. They will tell you to slow down when you begin to rise, to be careful when you begin to shine, to be realistic when you begin to believe. And if you are not careful, you will mistake their fear for wisdom. But there is a deeper truth beneath their words, one that does not concern you at all, but them. For jealousy is not a reflection of your becoming. It is a confession of their own unmet becoming. And once you understand this, you stop carrying their opinions like truth. You let them fall where they belong, outside of you. Jealousy rarely announces itself in a direct or honest way. It does not stand in front of you and declare, I am threatened by your growth. Instead, it learns to speak in quieter forms, softer tones, and carefully chosen phrases that can easily be mistaken for care. This is what makes it so difficult to recognize at first. It does not arrive as open hostility. It arrives as something that feels almost reasonable, a suggestion, a warning, a just thinking about you kind of sentence. And because it is wrapped in familiarity or politeness, it often slips past your awareness without resistance. People who carry jealousy rarely feel safe enough to admit it, even to themselves. So it transforms. It becomes disguised advice that limits instead of supports. It becomes concern that feels heavy instead of comforting. It becomes comparisons that are framed as facts but are actually subtle attempts to place you in a smaller space. When someone says, "Are you sure you can handle that?" Or maybe you should not aim too high. The words may appear harmless on the surface, but the energy beneath them often reveals something unspoken. It is not your capability they are truly questioning. It is the discomfort they feel watching you step into something they have not allowed themselves to pursue. This disguise is powerful because it blends into normal conversation. Not every cautious voice is rooted in jealousy, but jealousy often borrows the language of caution. It knows that direct negativity can be rejected, so it chooses subtlety instead. It hides behind logic, practicality, and even affection. That is why it can sound like guidance while quietly working against your confidence. The danger is not only in what is said, but in how it makes you begin to doubt your own instincts if you are not aware of the pattern. Over time, if you absorb these disguised messages without questioning them, they begin to shape your perception of yourself. You start to hesitate where you once moved freely. You begin to second-guess dreams that once felt clear. You may even confuse their limitations for your own. This is how jealousy operates most effectively. Not by attacking you openly, but by slowly influencing how you see your own potential. Recognizing this pattern requires emotional clarity. It asks you to listen not just to words, but to intention. To notice when advice expands your visions, when it quietly compresses it. To feel the difference between encouragement that lifts and concern that restricts. When you begin to see this distinction, the disguise loses its power. you stop internalizing every opinion as truth and start filtering it through awareness. You understand that not every voice that sounds caring is aligned with your growth, and not every hesitation offered to you is meant to protect you from harm. Jealous people often reveal far more about their inner world than they ever intend to reveal about yours. When they speak about your success, their words become an unintentional mirror, reflecting not your achievements, but their own sense of lack, their own unfinished desires, and the quiet discomfort they carry within themselves. What appears as criticism, sarcasm, or subtle dismissal is frequently not rooted in your reality at all, but in their inability to sit peacefully with their own. They do not always know how to articulate this inner emptiness, so it leaks out in comparison, in judgment, and in the quiet ways they attempt to minimize what they cannot emotionally digest. When someone is secure within themselves, another person's success does not feel like a threat. It feels like possibility, inspiration, or even neutrality. But jealousy shifts that balance. It turns someone else's progress into a reminder of personal stagnation. Instead of asking, "What can I learn from this?" the jealous mind asks, "Why not me?" And when that question has no honest answer they are willing to face, it often transforms into deflection. They begin to search for flaws in your journey, not because those flaws are truly central, but because identifying them gives temporary relief from their own internal discomfort. It is easier to point outward than to sit with what feels unresolved within. This is why their words often carry a strange mixture of attention and resistance. They are drawn to your growth, yet simultaneously unsettled by it. They may follow your progress closely, yet speak of it with hesitation or doubt. They might say things that sound like observations, but are actually emotional distancing techniques, ways to protect themselves from feeling left behind. In doing so, they unintentionally expose the gaps within their own fulfillment. Your success becomes a stage upon which their insecurities quietly performed. What makes this dynamic so important to understand is that it prevents you from misinterpreting their reactions as accurate reflections of your worth. If you are unaware of the emotional root behind their words, you may begin to internalize their limitations as your own. You might assume that their discomfort means you are doing something wrong, when in truth, it often means you are doing something they have not yet found the courage or clarity to do themselves. Their emptiness is not a measurement of your value. It is a reflection of unmet needs, unpursued dreams, and unresolved comparison. At the same time, recognizing this does not require anger or superiority. It requires distance in interpretation. It asks to see people not as judges of your path, but as individuals carrying their own internal narratives, some of which are heavy with regret or unfulfilled intention. When you begin to see jealousy through this lens, it loses its authority over your emotional state. Their words become less like verdicts and more like signals of where they are in their own journey, while you continue forward without needing their internal world to define yours. Growth is never a quiet thing, even when it happens in silence. It carries a kind of presence that cannot be fully hidden, because real transformation changes how a person moves, thinks, and exists in the world. You may not announce it, You may not even fully understand it at first, but growth has its own rhythm, and that rhythm eventually becomes noticeable to others. And when something becomes noticeable, it also becomes interpreted, and interpretation is where jealousy often begins to stir. Growth makes a sound not in words, but in contrast. It creates a difference between where you were and where you are now, and that difference is what people feel even before they can explain it. Not everyone is comfortable with that sound. For some, it reminds them of their own hesitation, their own paused decisions, their own dreams that remain untouched. When they hear the quiet evidence of your progress, it disrupts the stillness they have learned to accept in themselves. And that disruption can feel like pressure. Instead of asking themselves why it affects them so deeply, they may redirect that discomfort outward. They begin to react, sometimes subtly, sometimes openly, because your growth is no longer just your private experience. It has become a comparison they did not consent to but cannot ignore. This is why jealousy often appears most strongly when someone begins to rise beyond familiar boundaries. As long as you remain within a predictable range, there is little emotional disturbance. But the moment you expand, learn, change, or step into a version of yourself that is less familiar to others, the dynamic shifts. Your progress becomes a reminder that change is possible, and that reminder can either inspire or unsettle. Jealous reactions usually emerge when inspiration is replaced by discomfort, when someone sees in you what they feel they have delayed in themselves. Growth also carries visibility in subtle ways. It shows in confidence, in decision-making, in the way you no longer seek constant approval. These changes may seem small to you, but to others, they signal movement, and movement is difficult to ignore. It interrupts expectations. It challenges assumptions. It breaks the quiet agreement that things will remain the same. When that agreement is broken, people respond in the ways they know how. And jealousy is one of those responses that arises when emotional adaptation has not caught up with external change. There is also a deeper layer to this reaction. Some people do not simply see your growth. They measure themselves against it without meaning to. Your progress becomes a reference point, and that reference point can feel like pressure when they have not taken steps in their own direction. Instead of acknowledging this directly, they may express doubt about your path, question your timing, or minimize your achievements. These reactions are not always deliberate attacks. They are often emotional responses to a difference they feel, but cannot comfortably process. Understanding this allows you to stop interpreting every reaction as a reflection of your worth. Your growth is not responsible for how others feel about their own lives. It is simply movement, change unfolding in its natural direction. And while it may create sound in the form of attention, reaction, or resistance, that sound does not define the truth of your progress or the validity of your becoming. Learning to recognize subtle discouragement is not simply about identifying negativity in others. It is about refining your awareness of how influence moves through language, tone, and emotional weight. Discouragement is rarely delivered in an obvious form. It does not always sound like you cannot do it. More often, it arrives dressed as practicality, realism, or concern. It may sound like reminders of difficulty, warnings about risk, or suggestions that you are being too ambitious. On the surface, these statements can appear balanced, even responsible, but beneath them there can be a quiet attempt to slow your momentum before it fully forms. This kind of discouragement is subtle because it often blends truth with limitation. Yes, challenges exist. Yes, not everything works out easily. But subtle discouragement takes those universal truths and uses them to shrink possibility instead of preparing you for it. It emphasizes obstacles without acknowledging capability. It highlights failure without making space for resilience. And because it is not entirely false, it becomes harder to question. You may find yourself agreeing with it partially, and that partial agreement is where its influence begins to settle. Emotional wisdom begins when you learn to notice how something makes you feel after it is said. Genuine guidance, even when honest or firm, tends to leave a person with clarity, even if the truth is difficult. Subtle discouragement, however, often leaves behind hesitation. It plants small pauses in your thinking. It introduces doubt that did not exist before the conversation. You may notice yourself feeling less certain, less expansive, more careful in a way that feels heavier than thoughtful reflection. Recognizing this does not mean assuming bad intent in every voice of caution. Many people repeat discouraging patterns without awareness, shaped by their own experiences, fears, and limitations. They may believe they are offering protection, not realizing that protection can sometimes become restriction. Emotional wisdom allows you to hold this complexity without becoming reactive. You begin to separate intention from impact, understanding that someone can care about you and still project limitations onto your path. As awareness deepens, you start to see how discouragement often reveals more about the speaker's relationship with risk than about your actual ability. People who have been conditioned by disappointment may instinctively lean toward caution. Those who have experienced instability may equate ambition with danger. Their language becomes a reflection of their internal map, not necessarily the terrain of your reality. Emotional wisdom helps you avoid inheriting maps that were never drawn for your direction. This awareness also changes how you engage with your own thoughts. You begin to notice when external voices have been absorbed into your inner dialogue. The phrases you once heard from others may reappear in your mind at moments of decision, sounding like your own hesitation. Recognizing this overlap becomes essential because it allows you to trace certain doubts back to their source instead of assuming they originated within you. Over time, subtle discouragement loses its authority when it is consistently identified for what it is, not a definitive truth, but a filtered expression of perspective shaped by fear, experience, or limitation. And in that recognition, space begins to form between influence and choice, where your direction is not immediately shaped by the loudest caution in the room, but by something steadier underneath it. Silence, boundaries, and self-belief are not reactions to jealousy. They are protections of inner clarity. They are the quiet architecture that keeps your mind from being shaped by opinions that were never meant to guide your life. When jealousy appears in the words or behavior of others, it often seeks engagement. It wants explanation, defense, emotional response, or validation. But silence interrupts that cycle. It removes the fuel that allows outside projections to become internal conflict. Silence is not avoidance. It is discernment. It is the decision to no longer debate with energy that is not invested in your well-being. Boundaries in this context are not walls built out of anger. They are lines drawn out of understanding. They define where other people's emotions end and where your responsibility for your own peace begins. Without boundaries, every comment becomes an invitation to question yourself. Every opinion becomes something to analyze, every action something to decode. But with boundaries, you begin to filter what deserves access to your attention. Not every voice is entitled to shape your confidence. Not every reaction requires your participation. Boundaries allow you to stay connected without becoming consumed. Jealousy often tries to blur these boundaries. It may come disguised as closeness, advice, or emotional involvement. It may insist that you explain yourself, justify your choices, or reconsider your direction. Without strong internal boundaries, you may feel obligated to engage, to clarify, to be understood. But understanding is not always required for progress. Sometimes clarity is enough for you, even if it is not shared by others. Boundaries give you permission to stop over-explaining your path to people who are not walking it with you. Self-belief becomes the foundation that holds everything together. Without it, silence can feel like isolation, and boundaries can feel like separation. But with self-belief, they become strength. Self-belief is the internal agreement that your direction does not require external approval to remain valid. It is the quiet certainty that your growth is not dependent on being understood in every moment. When self-belief is strong, external doubt loses its ability to destabilize you. It may still exist, but it no longer dictates your internal state. Together, silence, boundaries, and self-belief form a kind of emotional stability that jealousy cannot easily penetrate. Silence prevents unnecessary entanglement. Boundaries prevent emotional overreach. Self-belief prevents internal collapse. Each one supports the others, creating a structure that keeps you grounded even when external voices attempt to pull you into confusion or comparison. This combination does not make you distant from people. It makes you selective with influence. You begin to understand that protecting your energy is not an act of separation from life, but an act of preserving your ability to move through it with clarity. Not every opinion deserves a response. Not every reaction deserves attention. Not every emotion around you requires absorption. In that understanding, you begin to move with a steadier sense of direction, where your focus is no longer easily disrupted by the shifting emotions of others, and your inner world remains anchored in what you know to be true about your path.